springtime of '76, the towns were cold and tense. Folks were talking about the empire and what loyal even meant. Some said stick with Britain, others said we've had enough. But Paine walked in with common sense and called their bluff. He said, why keep a king just 'cause he's always been there? And suddenly the room got quiet, foes began to stare. 'Cause common sense was in the air, blowing through the taverns everywhere. People read it, people said it, hey, maybe power needs consent. From fear to fact, from doubt to stance, they found their voice, they took their chance. By the time the spring came rolling in, independence felt like common sense.
They tried petitions, tried appeals, they'd waited for a sign. But every ship from London brought a brand new warning line. Troops in town, courts shut down, trials across the sea. Folks said, if this is government, it ain't protecting me.
Some feared chaos, some feared kings, some feared what tomorrow brings. But fear turned into questions, and questions turned to claims. By what right does he rule us if he's waging war the same?
And once they asked that question loud, the old belief just couldn't stay.
'Cause common sense was in the air, blowing through the taverns everywhere. People read it, people spread it, hey, maybe power needs consent. From fear to fact, from doubt to stance, they found their voice, they took their chance. By the time the spring came rolling in, independence felt like common sense. So when Jefferson picked up his pen, the verdict was already made. The people weren't beginning, they were closing out the case. The grievances weren't guesses, they were what folks lived and knew. The king had quit his duty, so the people started new. Yeah, common sense was in the air, and the Declaration made it clear. You don't reconcile with power that's abandoned every trust. You stand up, you speak out, you say the bond is broken just. From winter fears to July's voice, the people made a faithful choice. And when they signed their names that day,
Independence felt like common sense.
Renewal by Anderson brings you hour 3 of our Tuesday morning on Bill Mick Live. And Tuesday mornings at 8 o'clock, it's always Dave Bowman with Dave Does History on Bill Mick Live. And by the way, links on the show page today. It is entitled Life Lessons from Sport at BillMick.com. There's a link to Dave Bowman and everything that he does with Dave Does History. And Dave, we were talking about elected officials and this form of government that we had as we closed hour number 2. We're in the lead up stages to the declaration of our independence from Great Britain. And today, from common sense to common grievance, and we seem to list those pretty well, actually.
If we go back in our history, we find there are times when the American people are highly united. And usually in those times, we find that our politicians are scrambling to catch up with what the people have decided they want. By way of example, the fastest amendments to the Constitution of the United States outside of the Bill of Rights, we're not going to talk about those today. How long does it take to ratify an amendment? Well, if you're talking about the 27th Amendment, it took, 230 years or something like that? I mean, it's kind of absurd. But some of these passed pretty quickly. The 12th Amendment, which was in response to the disaster of the 1800 election, which nearly destroyed the country, took 6 months from the time Congress sent it out to the states to ratify it because the people were not happy with the way things go. The 17th Amendment, which we could spend a lot of time arguing about, the direct election to senators, there were reasons for it, but the people of the nation were very unhappy with the way the Senate was working. Now, we don't understand that today, but that's what had happened.
I think we understand that we're unhappy with how the Senate's working today.
Well, but in 1917, it was even worse.
Yeah, okay.
That amendment took 11 months, less than a year, to be ratified from the time it went to the states till it was ratified. The 20th Amendment, which was the lame duck presidency nonsense where we used to do it in March instead of January, which was causing problems, that took 10 months. The 21st Amendment, probably my favorite, the repeal of prohibition, took 9.5 months. The 26th Amendment was the fastest amendment ever ratified. Anybody remember what that was for? The people of the United States were very upset in 1971 because of the political situation that was going on in the world. And the people of the United States were beginning to say, look, if you're old enough to carry a gun and be drafted, you're old enough to vote. And the 26th Amendment took exactly 3 months to be ratified because Congress finally got their stuff together and said, you know, the people want this. We had better answer them. By the winter of 1776, it wasn't Congress, the Continental Congress, leading the nation. Sure, they were kind of in charge of the Continental Army, which by that point was being reconstituted. Sure, they were in charge of, international relationships, trying to negotiate with France. Sure, they were in charge of monetary policies and those sorts of things. But reality was the drive for independence wasn't being debated in the halls of Philadelphia. It was being debated in the taverns in Waterford, in Guilford Courthouse, in Richmond, in Savannah. It was being debated and decided not by the people that we know their names of, but by all the people who were sitting in their taverns, their churches, their parlors, with a small little pamphlet in their hands that we've talked about before, called, of course, Common Sense.
And we pick it up in a minute on WMMB. Of course, you can find our podcast there on the app and at the top of the page at BillMick.com. Also for the Florida Roundtable, where this weekend we'll be talking Florida property insurance problems and potential solutions. Catch it this weekend on WMMB. So Common Sense gets out. The people are talking it, Dave, and the Continental Congress a little behind the times on it.
Continental Congress is a lot behind the times about it, but we'll get there. What I want you to do today is I want you to get out of the mindset of the 21st century American with your history books and you know about common sense and you know the impact that it has. I want you to forget all of that for just a few moments. I want you to try to put yourself in the mind of a colonial in that winter of 1776. We have this image in our head that everybody was on fire for independence. Everybody thought this was a great idea. And the truth is somewhat different than that. Pamphlets, like Common Sense, were not uncommon. These were things that went around quite a bit. In fact, we're going to talk about one of them next week, written by another founding father. But there are these pamphlets, they're not just pieces of paper. They're social instruments. They're lived in conversation, if you will. They're read aloud, not because most of the listeners couldn't read, although many could not, but because there weren't enough of them to go around. And so you would sit in a tavern, you would sit in the church, you would sit in the parlor, wherever, someone would read it, and you would discuss it. And it wasn't just men, folks. There were a lot of women, and there are numerous stories about the women of Massachusetts discussing these things and discussing these political ideas.
So it was the media of the day.
It was more than the media. It's more the social media of the day in so many ways. Revolutions are not carried forward by abstractions. They are carried forward by people. And in the process of this, they're carried forward by shopkeepers, farmers, printers, sailors. They're men who argue after work. we used to do that. Remember, you'd go to the bar and talk about politics. The Power of Common Sense by Thomas Paine is not in its originality. Thomas Paine doesn't have any radical ideas. He doesn't have any original ideas. He's not saying anything that somebody else hasn't said. What he has is timing. It's going to land at a moment when Americans are already talking about these things. They're already angry, like we were in 71 about drafting 18-year-olds. We're already confused by what's going to happen next. By 1776, by winter of 1776, blood has been spilled. Boston is occupied by the British. Trade has been broken. Port cities feel strangled. And even out in the rural communities, they feel like they're being watched. Everyone is feeling the strain. We don't lack grievances. What we lack is an ability to make sense of the whole thing. And when Paine's Common Sense comes along, it establishes that framework. It doesn't supply facts. This isn't the Declaration of Independence where we're listing the things that the king has done wrong. It literally gives us permission to ask questions that hitherto we have not been willing to ask. He doesn't explain the injustices of the whole thing. He actually introduces the idea for discussion that the system producing that injustice might actually be the problem. That the fact that this hereditary king, which is ridiculous in his mind, is really the issue. Now, the distinction is subtle, but it's also explosive. For more than a decade, the Americans have been arguing about Parliament, about ministers, about policies. And even after Lexington and Concord, many still frame the relationship as anger as resistance to the relationship. The king might be misguided, we thought. He might be misled. He might even be harsh, but he remained in some emotional sense necessary. But it's Paine who really opens up the idea that we're just using that as an emotional crutch. He asks a question that feels impolite, even reckless, and it's very simply this: why should any man be allowed to rule by inheritance at all? Why should a continent be bound to an island? Why should tradition excuse power that no longer protects us? These are not questions that he poses delicately. They are literally flung onto the table on the paperwork, and they become, because they're asked in such plain language, they invite reply, they invite debate, and people start arguing back. They test the claims. They repeat them to see, how does this sound if I say it? How often do we do that today? Common sense in our modern thinking is often treated as propaganda that sweeps the colonies with a wave of enthusiasm. But that's not what happened. It provokes debate, not unanimity. And the debate is the point. Nowhere is this more clear than in the responses that you're going to see in newspapers. There is an entire series of letters from a writer named Cato who says Paine is, look, we've got a problem, but maybe this isn't it. They're not trivial objections. There is a debate and discussion going on. The objections will fly. And it's a subtle thing, but at the same time, it is this debate, this discussion in the parlors that allows us to reason ourselves, which then Congress decides, maybe we better follow along.
And we pick it up in just moments right here on WMMB.
This is Dave Does History on Bill Mick Live. All the way from Silverdale, Washington, here's Dave Bowman on Bill Mick Live.
Renewal by Anderson are our sponsor. And as we're looking at getting the public riled up enough to question the legitimacy of serving under a king. Dave, back to you, my friend.
This is the kind of stuff I love. This is what we do in talk radio in so many ways. We debate these issues, we discuss these issues, and it's that kind of forum that we're looking at here in 1776, in this winter of 1776, is Congress is just dithering. Now, they're debating the same issues, whether we should declare independence or not, but they're kind of distracted by other issues. I mean, George Washington writing him every day saying, hey, I need gunpowder. You got the naval issues. You've got political issues with France, and you've got all this stuff going on. And so independence to them, while it's important in the viewpoint of people like John Adams, it's already an established fact. I mean, the very fact that the king is shooting at us makes us independent. So why are we worrying about that right now? But for the average American sitting out here in their church, in their parlors, in their taverns, wherever, drinking their tankards, these are the arguments of the day. And of course, you've got the pamphlet, Common Sense. You have other pamphlets that are out there that are making the same kind of arguments. But now you've got letters from this writer who names himself Cato. We've talked in the past about why this use of these Roman Republican names is so important. Cato is seen as someone who is moderate, someone who is a senator, willing to consider things slowly, not react out of anger. And as Common Sense begins to gain ground, and as more and more people begin to read it, debate it, argue it, Cato's letters begin to appear in newspapers. If you go to my website today, dave.history.org, you'll see a picture of one of the letters that Cato writes in the Philadelphia Gazette. Cato's argument is the opposite of Paine's arguments without disagreeing with Paine. He says the monarchy is flawed, but it's familiar. And that's an important phrase because remember, it's going to come into play in the Declaration of Independence. Independence, he argues, is an experiment with no guarantees at all. And this is something that scares people. It scares people today. Okay, if we get rid of this, I mean, we all don't like this, but what do we replace it with? It's like a soccer team or a sports team replacing their coach. Okay, we get rid of the coach, now what? Paine's arguments that the monarchy is illegitimate, the island can't rule a continent, are fiery and they are important. But Cato's idea is the choice is not between oppression and freedom, it's between danger and uncertainty. It's this idea that somehow or another we are facing this monumental choice, which is going to decide our future pretty much forever. And Cato's argument, and many Americans' argument, is very simply, we probably shouldn't just rush into this.
All right, Dave, so where are we off to now?
So Cato's arguments that, look, we need to be cautious, we need to be careful, are butting heads directly with Paine's arguments that this is over. The time for discussion is past. And as people begin...
Is he operating from a position of fear?
Paine? No. Paine
No, Cato.
Cato is not necessarily operating from fear, but he is concerned about what happens if we do this. And I think that's a legitimate fear. There were fears in 1971. What if we give all these 18-year-olds who we've now taught to shoot the vote? I mean, there were legitimate arguments about, is that a good idea?
They're burning draft cards and bras. Why should we let them vote? There you go.
Well, but I mean, what impact would they have politically? Same kind of fears about the future are involved here. Cato's arguments aren't bad arguments, but his primary position is that, look, the monarchy has made a mistake. It's being misled. It's being misadvised. And Paine's argument is, no, this entire system is flawed. And by allowing this system to continue to operate, we are just being, well, we're being attacked. And in fact, he brings in the idea that the crown has abdicated its purpose. Now, abdicated today has a different meaning than it did in 1776. What it meant was that the king replaces law with force, which is, of course, what we're seeing. And as these people are debating this stuff, remember that they're getting newspapers from Virginia where they're reading about how Lord Dunmore has burned Norfolk. They're getting reports from Georgia about how the governor down in Georgia is threatening to unleash terror on people. They're getting reports from Boston about things being burned. They're getting reports from Falmouth about the shelling of the city. They're seeing all these things happening. In the cities, they're seeing the British troops come in and quarter themselves in their homes. The argument that Cato is making might make sense if none of that was happening, but because it's all happening and the king has replaced law with force, he has denied us his protection, which is the specific price of allegiance. It's very clear that when the king has withdrawn his protection, he has left the building. He's abdicated his government here by declaring us out of his protection and waging war against us. If you're going to do that, then really, why are we even dealing with this? And as Paine's arguments are shared more and more, this whole argument begins to resonate with the American people. And it becomes to the point where more and more Americans are beginning to see things in the same vein. They don't see why they should be loyal to a crown that isn't protecting them. In fact, loyalty without protection is just submission. That's all it is. Allegiance has to be reciprocal. It means that if we're going to be loyal to you, you have an obligation to us. Force, replacing law, you're using troops, you're doing all the things we've talked about with regards to the trials, moving things overseas. And most importantly, this talk of reconciliation, this idea that somehow we can work this out. Reconciliation becomes a delaying tactic rather than a solution. Calls like Cato's for patience they're seen not as arguments for moderation, but as avoidance of responsibility. Each appeal to wait only postpones the acknowledgement that the relationship is already over and we need to move on. The king, in our view, has already left the building. The only question remaining is whether or not we're going to continue to pretend otherwise. We don't end here with defiance, but with recognition, and that's what Paine accomplishes. Government protection has been withdrawn. What remains is force, and force cannot sustain legitimacy.
We'll see where it goes and take your calls when we continue on Bill McLive.
Call Bill now, 321-768-1240.
Renewal by Anderson, this hour's sponsor. As we get ready to wrap up, Dave Does History. Dave, so the debate's on. Paine has written Common Sense. It seems to be winning the debate over what Cato brought into play, wanting to wait and hold on. And the public seems to be grasping Paine's ideas here.
They certainly do. They grasp his ideas, and they don't just grasp them, they embrace them. And this is where we begin to see this ideal of American philosophy that we're going to see later on in things like the 26th Amendment. This realization that Congress finally begins to have as winter turns to spring is that the people of the United States have reconciled themselves to the idea of independence. As John Adams will later write, independence, the American Revolution doesn't end, it doesn't, start with the Declaration of Independence. It starts with that mind shift of the Americans. Once the American people have made up their mind that it's independence, the revolution is over. Now we just have to make it true. When Jefferson sits down to write these things, he's not writing things that he has just dreamed up himself. He is talking about the things that Americans have experienced. He's writing these in confidence and in anxiety. The Declaration takes shape by the time he does that, we're no longer debating whether independence is desirable. That argument is over. It's done. What dominates this winter is something far more unsettling. It's not panic. It's not hysteria. It's a steady, grinding apprehension, though, about what will happen when power no longer listens and force becomes normal. When the king is going to do that, well, what happens? This is kind of the emotional temperature of common sense, I think, that we often miss today when we read Common Sense, if we even read it, or the Declaration. The Declaration, that list of grievances can sound kind of theatrical. It sounds kind of strange to our modern ears, especially when we strip out the context of what's going on, as if Jefferson is just piling on accusations to justify what is already a foregone conclusion. But in reality, the grievances read the way the anxious people are talking when they're finally forced to be precise. By the winter of 76, all these things that we're concerned about become almost verbatim in legal language. We're afraid of the military rule. We write, he has affected to render the military independent of and superior to the civil power. We're afraid of justice being severed from our community. We write, for transporting us beyond seas to be tried for pretended offenses. We're concerned that distance is being turned into a weapon rather than a boundary. These aren't abstractions. These are lived concerns that are debated in these cold rooms over the winter by people who have already been watching all the familiar institutions just erode away. The grievances are simply the lived experiences of the Americans. And as the debates intensify into the winter and into the spring, the fears surface repeatedly. But what if? But what if? But what if? What happens when soldiers enforce policy rather than law? What happens when obedience is extracted rather than consented to? Hey, shouldn't power require consent? What happens when commandments replace judgments? These grievances aren't necessarily about uniforms in the street. It's about a future in which civic life survives only because at the pleasure of an armed power. And as we understood justice, we wanted it local. We still want it local today. But somehow or another, these things are weighing so heavily upon us that we begin to, as the arguments go on, we begin to resolve in our own minds that the only way we're going to solve this is to get rid of the king, declare independence, and make ourselves responsible for these things. And so this anxiety of the winter, when all these people are gathered in these dark parlors, in these churches, in these taverns, where things are debated and discussed. And sometimes I regret, Bill, that we don't do that anymore.
Yeah, I'm with you. And it's so few people are actually engaged. Communities were engaged at this time.
And not only were they engaged, but they were passionate about this. And they were willing to listen to the counter arguments, and the same publishers who published Common Sense were publishing the counter arguments. And the debate went on and on and on. As the argument develops from the anxiety, it eventually reaches a point where Congress, sensing the will of the people, says it might be time to act. No, it is time to act. And as the mood of the country becomes very, very pro-independence, Congress, of course, is finally going to say, you know what? We need to have a vote. We need to have a draft declaration. We need to address these items. We're not going to introduce new things. We're just simply going to catalog them. We're going to translate months of anxious conversation into a formal record. This is why the Declaration's structure matters. It doesn't just list grievances, it builds them. Each charge reinforces the sense that the problem is systemic, as Paine said, rather than episodic. Taken together, they're not misrule, but transformation. Governance by the king has been replaced by domination. We are simply submissive to the king, and that's not what we're supposed to be. Common sense will teach Americans to stop hoping. It will strip away the comfort that reconciliation might rescue them from hard decisions. The Declaration teaches us to testify to that fact. It demands that we name our fears, that we organize them, that we place them on record. Common sense removes the illusion. The Declaration imposes responsibility. Together they show that independence is not a leap of faith. It is a conclusion reached reluctantly, loudly, and publicly. The Declaration does not shout victory. It delivers a testimony. And in that testimony, the anxieties of winter become the changes and charges of history. And by the time the Declaration is written down, independence was just common sense.
And we're back to wrap it up in just a minute with your calls here on Bill Mick Live. Line 2, you're up on Bill Mick Live. Good morning.
Hey, good morning, guys. This is Keith Palm Bay. I might have missed in the first 5 minutes. You were talking about Cato. Did we ever find out who that was? Was it Benjamin Franklin? I think I heard that in the National Treasure with Nicolas Cage or something. But who was the Cato writer?
Did we just reference National Treasure?
The historical document, yes.
I love that movie. I want to be clear. I love the movies National Treasure, but not because they're history. I just love them because they're fun. The important thing to keep in mind here is that there are multiple Catos, and the people are most familiar with Cato as an anti-federalist who will write in the 1787, 1788 era, arguing against constitutional issues. That Cato in that era may have been Ben Franklin. To me, it seems unlikely, although he is one of the candidates. I believe it was probably more George Clinton, but that's a Constitution Thursday episode, and if you search my website, davedoeshistory.org, you can find all kinds of stuff about the anti-federalist, federalist arguments, and that particular Cato. This Cato, not really clear on who he is. I'm not absolutely convinced that his argument wasn't valid, but Paine's argument demolishes it, and that's the important thing to keep in mind, is that the people accepted Paine's argument after discussion and debate. The people decided that independence was just common sense.
Dave, you say next week we're going to take a look at yet another pamphlet. These things were prolific at the time. What are we digging into next week?
Well, that'll be tangential. We're actually going to talk about another one of the founding fathers that we don't talk a lot about. A guy without whom we wouldn't have chased the British out of Boston. About this time of year in 1776, he did something that was thought to be impossible, and George Washington was eternally grateful.
That's ahead next Tuesday right here on Bill Mick Live. Thanks for spending your day with us here today. Renewal by Anderson made this hour possible. We'll see you in the morning for a wide open Wednesday. By the way, no gay days in Orlando this year. We'll get into that and more. Dave Bowman, thank you. We'll see you next week.
See you then.
Common sense was in the air, and the Declaration made it clear. You don't reconcile with power that's abandoned every trust. You stand up, you speak out, you say the bond is broken just. From winter fears to July's voice, the people made a faithful choice. And when they signed their names that day,
Independence felt like common sense.